So, boys, at the time of recording this video, PoE is currently crashing and burning, and load screens are like quadruple what they should be, so I figured I'd make another video that doesn't require me to actually play the game. Now, if you remember in my last video, I had some rather choice words for a certain ascendancy that a lot of people seem to enjoy. A lot of you didn't like my my opinions on the Occultist, so I figured instead of just making some of you upset, why don't I try to make all of you upset? So we're going to talk about every single ascendancy in the game. And we're not only going to talk about it, I'm going to give them a rating out of 5, and I'm also going to see about trying to fix every one of the ascendancies based off of the things that I think are wrong with it. So remember, boys, if you're enjoying this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos. And without further ado, let's get into it. So let's talk about how we're going to be grading these ascendancies. So these are going to be out of 5. You can get half points, you can get full points, or you can get 0 points on each of the different criteria. The first point is going to be whether or not the ascendancy has a unique mechanic that is either only available to that ascendancy or it is very, very difficult to get otherwise. Now, a lot of people took this the wrong way, I think, in the last video, so let me kind of try to explain this a little bit better. So when I say I want an ascendancy to have a unique mechanic that is only available to that ascendancy, the reason for that is that I don't think it's a good thing if the ascendancies are purely reliant on just their numbers and their power level to be able to survive, if that makes sense. I think that the ascendancies having something unique to them where you can get a unique and interesting and powerful mechanic no matter what, and it's the only way to do it, guarantees that these ascendancies will have some form of use going forward into the future. When you get ascendancies that just are completely based off of their power and none of their mechanics are really that interesting, there's no game-defining mechanics available to that ascendancy, you have situations where it gets down to like something like the Chieftain, where there's not really anything that the Chieftain brings to the table. It's got basically like half of a unique mechanic, and that's the only build that people play with the Chieftain for the most part. And you just run into these situations where the ascendancy just doesn't feel very good, almost ever. That's the reason why I'm grading this so important. And keep in mind, you can completely disagree with my grading system, but it's my grading system and my video, so I get to do what I want. The next point is, how good are the defensive options? Does it have multiple defensive options? Are these defensive options like, you know, current with what is available in PoE? Are they worse than what's available now that we've gotten like the defensive rework? How are they? And then, of course, another point for offensive options. Does the ascendancy have multiple separate offensive options that do interesting things, that make the ascendancy good, that give it enough damage to be able to like complete content in the game? The next point is going to be, how many builds or archetypes can the ascendancy sustain? Like, is it a one-trick pony? Can it actually, you know, can you play like 3 or 4 different builds on it? Like, how many builds can it actually sustain? And then last, but definitely not least, is it actually good? Do people play it? Are the numbers there? Is it like a functioning ascendancy? That's going to be point number 5. And then, of course, if there are issues with the ascendancy, I'm going to attempt to fix some of them with just some ideas that I've kind of been tossing around with the people over my Discord or on stream and various other places. I've kind of just been thinking about this for about a week or 2. So first, let's talk about the assassin. So when it comes to unique mechanics, I do feel that the assassin actually has a few unique mechanics into it. We've got elusive on crit, which isn't completely unique, but it's only really available through like boots. And then the increased elusive effect is actually pretty unique here. It does give you no extra damage from critical strikes while elusive, which is all pretty powerful. On top of that, it does have some unique ways to scale crit, as well as unique ways to recover life with poison. Also does allow you to scale poison duration extremely well. It is a relatively unique ascendancy. The power charge stuff isn't super unique. These nodes do have some unique aspects to them, but they're kind of just whatever generic nodes that you're supposed to take anyways. But it does have at least some unique things to it that you can't really get elsewhere easily, so I'm going to give it a full point for that. When it comes to defensive options, it's only going to get a half point, and that's mainly because the only real defensive option that it's got is Mistwalker. This is pretty good. It is a unique thing that the Ascendancy does have. Taking no extra damage from critical strikes while elusive is really powerful, and you can become elusive most of the time on this build. The only other defensive option that it really has is Recover Life per Poison. Unfortunately, this isn't super useful all of the time. It doesn't really work on bosses or single target or longer encounters. It only really works for clearing, so it's just kind of okay. I feel that there's a little bit lacking here. It needs either some kind of like DR, some kind of like unique scaling defensive. Like, we need an elusive line that makes it so that elusive is more consistent for the assassin. That would probably be good, because unfortunately in current day PoE, inconsistent defensive mechanics just really aren't that good. So it's only getting a half point here. When it comes to offensive options, I do feel that it gets a full point. There are multiple options that you can choose to scale offenses on this Ascendancy. You've got the poison line, which allows you to scale crit. You've got power charges, which allows you to do power charge stacking and crit based kind of stuff for pretty much any kind of build. This gives you a ton of crit. And then on top of that, you do just have some generic nodes that kind of work for pretty much any options that you want. Like if you're playing a poison build, or if you're playing just a generic crit build, a caster build, an attack build, whatever it is that you're playing, these do work for it. So it is going to get a full point for offense. Now, when it comes to like archetypes or builds that this Ascendancy can sustain, I am only going to give it a half point here because the only build that actually really functions right now is the poison variants here, and it doesn't even do that super well. It's only because of like Nightblade and scaling and things like that that this even works kind of as a poison Ascendancy right now. Going back in history, I would give this Ascendancy more, but due to all of the nerfs and such that it's gotten, it really isn't as good as it used to be. It doesn't have good enough numbers along with the mechanics to sustain more than just a couple of builds right now, so it's kind of in a weaker spot, especially when Occultist exists. So it's only going to get a half point for that. Now, when it comes to is the Ascendancy actually good? Is it played? Are the numbers there? I can't really give it a point here. It really only has, I think people play the Cast on Death build as an assassin, but besides that, it's pretty much only like Poison Helix and some people playing some random Cast on Crit shenanigans. But even at the super high end, a lot of Cast on Crit people are going towards the Occultist now, so Assassin doesn't really get very much there. So this leaves the Assassin at an overall 3 out of 5. It's an okay Ascendancy that does have some interesting things there. It's just kind of being outshadowed by another Ascendancy, unfortunately. Now, when it comes to fixing it, I do think that the Assassin always excelled at Poison, and I think Poison was a good thing for this Ascendancy to be pushed into. I think it needs some love when it comes to Poison, maybe giving the Mistwalker line a little bit more consistency. I think one of the things that the Assassin is missing these days is a consistent defensive layer. The problem with PoE now is that if your defenses are inconsistent, they're kind of just bad. You really need those defenses up all the time, and Mistwalker doesn't really do that. It's pretty good, but it has this like scaling effect that goes from like top to bottom and makes it so that sometimes you're actually really protected and other times you're really not protected. Beyond that, I don't really agree what they did with the poison changes that happened with Toxic Delivery and Noxious Strikes that happened a while back when they just made poisons generically better and kind of nerfed the assassin. I don't like the game going that way. I would prefer that they had just left the assassin the same but buffed poison in and of itself and maybe nerfed some of the abilities down or something like that. Leave some of the power in the Ascendancy, but GGG doesn't typically like that. So moving on to the Trickster. Now, the Trickster is kind of a meme. This is easily one of the worst Ascendancies in the game right now. It's not even close. When it comes to unique mechanics that are difficult to get elsewhere, only unique mechanic that the Trickster actually had was stolen from it and tossed onto the tree in Ghost Dance. Beyond that, there really isn't anything here besides movement skills cost no mana, and that's almost completely useless these days. I looked through these and I really sat down and I was like, is there anything that's really unique and useful at the same time? Because Heartstopper is unique, but it's bad. It has almost no purpose. I think maybe there was like one meme build that used this Ascendancy point, and that was pretty much it. Frenzy Charge Generation isn't unique. Gaining extra damage of Chaos damage is kind of unique, but it's mostly useless because this is the damage over time Ascendancy. So gaining on hit damage extra doesn't really fit very well here. It doesn't really make very much sense. This was an Ascendancy point that kind of worked back when there was like double triple dipping and that was much more prevalent. That kind of worked back then, but that's been nerfed into the ground at this point, so this node really doesn't have a purpose anymore. This Ascendancy is just rough. It needs, in my opinion, a complete rework. It at least needs a new node that isn't bad like Heartstopper, but yeah, Trickster is in a very rough spot right now. When it comes to defensive options, I give it half a point just because it does have like some stuff going for it. Like you've got some good recovery with Patient Reaper, you've got like some evasion and energy shield stacking, you've got Heartstopper does something. I think that the Ascendancy does have a few ways that it can at least scale some defenses, so it's getting half a point here. When it comes to offenses, this Ascendancy pretty much has nothing. Unfortunately, it being like the damage over time Ascendancy, the numbers aren't really there. They nerfed the damage over time from this Ascendancy previously. Damage over time abilities in general have just kind of been nerfed. This Ascendancy just really isn't giving very many offensive options. And unfortunately, the offensive options that it does give kind of don't have a purpose in the game right now, so can't really give it a point there. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? No one plays this. There's no archetypes, there's no builds. Damage over time, it's worse as a damage over time Ascendancy right now, and it doesn't really have any other identities besides like double triple dipping type stuff, and that isn't a thing anymore, so doesn't get a point here. And then the final question, is it actually good? Is it played? No, it has like 0.2, I think, representation on the entirety of the ladder, no matter what point in the league that you go to. And the point that I knew that Trickster was pretty much dead and gone, people started taking like ED Contagion builds and moving them over to a champion instead of the Trickster. ED Contagion was like the Trickster build. It was like the build that people played on Trickster. And when even those people started moving off of Trickster, there was nothing left. So overall, Trickster gets a 0.5, putting it securely in the very, very bottom of the list. Now let's talk about Saboteur. Saboteur is in a pretty good place. There is only one real problem with Saboteur, and that is that the mine section of Saboteur is a little on the weaker side. But because of all the strengths of everything else, I think Saboteur is still in a pretty solid spot. Now, is Saboteur going to be nerfed next patch? Probably, and maybe they'll just nerf the abilities like Seismic Trap and such instead, but you know how GGG is. So starting with unique mechanics that are difficult to get otherwise, Saboteur has quite a few of them. Enemies being blinded, DR with that blind, and just always blinding on hit is a very powerful, unique mechanic that's pretty difficult to get otherwise. That DR portion of it is pretty solid. Now, the cannot be blinded doesn't really matter for the Saboteur that much, but just the 100% chance to blind on everything that you do and those enemies just dealing significantly less damage to you, very unique, very powerful mechanic that's very hard to get elsewhere. On top of that, it does have this node where it makes it so that when traps trigger, nearby traps also trigger, giving you super high AoE, super good cooldown recovery. This is very unique. These stats are very hard to get elsewhere. Giant AoE of traps and giant cooldown recovery is very, very difficult to obtain. Chances for your traps to trigger in additional time, reduced cost of those traps is also very unique. However, when it comes to the mine section, it is a little bit weak, but because it does have so many other powerful mechanics, I do have to give it a point for uniqueness. When it comes to defensive options, this Ascendancy does have multiple powerful defensive options. Born in the Shadows is just really, really, really strong. This is such a universally good defensive layer for any build that this Ascendancy plays that it's really hard for me to not give the Saboteur a point when it comes to Born in the Shadows. It also does have Pyromaniac, which gives you a ton of recovery, as well as immunity to Ignite and Shock, means you don't have to get it elsewhere. Very powerful defensive layers here just in these two nodes, and you don't really need to like spend any more points in that because you pretty much are only taking either 2 trap nodes or 2 mine nodes. And if you don't need either of these defenses, you can move into Explosive Excerpts, which gives you some more as well. So it gets a full point for defenses. For offenses, it also does get a full point, but because you do have just a generic, like if you do any kind of elemental damage, you've got some extra stats here. You can get Burning, Shocking, and Chilling very easily through just the mechanics that work around the Saboteur. Skitterbots can provide 2 of those, and then if you put Infernal Legion on them, they're also burning. So this is very, very easy to basically use on any build whatsoever. And then the options that we do get through traps make it so that a bunch of trap abilities that are very powerful are able to be used quite well in the Saboteur. The only real downside, once again, is that ever since they changed mines to be like a mana reservation, they kind of just haven't felt good, and I think the whole idea of making mines reserve mana was a little bit of a mistake. I think they need to relook that, but I don't think that they will. So it does get a full point for offensives just because it does have choices. It does have quite a few of them, and they are relatively solid. Now, how many archetypes and builds can it sustain? I'm giving it half a point here because the Saboteur is a very specialized Ascendancy, and I feel that if both mines and traps were worth playing at the current moment, I feel that the Ascendancy would get a full point here and it would be a 5 out of 5, but unfortunately traps is the only side that really works in the current game. And the problem is actually with the Ascendancy, I feel. When we look at the different mine abilities that we have here, it just doesn't give enough to make mines worthwhile. Like realistically, I think we need like this Demolition Specialist thing where we get like increased effective auras from mines and such. It's cool and all, but I just don't know that we get enough for mines here. Like, can't we get some like some of that like reservation effect of mines back just to make it so we can toss more mines on the ground? It needs something, but that's the only real way that I can ding this Ascendancy. Everything else about it is really solid. And once again, fixing it, it's just kind of the mines problem. Mines just really aren't that great at the moment. They need something like either mana reservation efficiency for mines thrown or just something like that. Because when they changed the way that mines worked, they just completely reduced the viability of that type of play and gave basically nothing back to the Ascendancy. They actually took stuff from the Ascendancy at the same time, so that was pretty rough. So overall, it gets a 4.5 out of 5. Now, next league, I do think that the trap section and traps in general might be nerfed, and if they nerf too many of the traps, I don't think the Saboteur is going to be too popular. but it is what it is. Overall, I think it's a good Ascendancy that works quite well. It's just kind of lacking in the mind department right now. Next, we have the Deadeye, the Ascendancy that all of the big, juicy bow players love to play. Now, when it comes to this Ascendancy, when it comes to like unique mechanics that are difficult to get elsewise, I do feel that this Ascendancy has it, even if some of them aren't really currently used because those abilities aren't great right now. They are unique and like thematic and interesting. Things like Occupying Force is a very unique node. I don't actually think you can get this anywhere else in the game. I just don't think it's available. Then on top of that, we do have the like increasing the effect of Tailwind through Gale Force and taking reduced damage. Even though people really don't use Wind Ward, Gale Force is still a very, very unique mechanic that specifically only the Deadeye has, I'm pretty sure. Then on top of that, we've got like Focal Point, transferring your marks around, making them more powerful and making it so that enemies around the mark take less damage. And then Rupturing is very unique. It's just not very good because it doesn't really work well with the whole idea of bleeding. And then you've got a bunch of generic nodes up at the top that pretty much anybody can take. So for unique mechanics that the Deadeye has, absolutely it has them. A ton of them in spades. Some of the most unique mechanics in the game, actually. Now, when it comes to defensive options, I feel that this is kind of where the Deadeye fails. So the Deadeye genuinely has pretty much no good defensive options that really matter. The only real defensive option that I think the Deadeye has right now is Focal Point. The reason for this is that 25% less damage taken from other enemies near your marked enemy is relatively powerful while clearing, but the problem with the Deadeye is that that's not really the issue that it has. The Deadeye clears extremely well. It has absolutely no problem clearing. You're killing mobs off screen before they even get somewhat close to you. So the problem here is that Focal Point doesn't really do anything for the bosses themselves, because when it says 25% less damage taken from other enemies near your marked enemy, that doesn't count for the marked enemy itself. Other defensive layer, which is Wind Ward, is simply just not taken. The problem here, I think, is that you lose all of the stacks when you're hit, and with the way that evasion currently works, you do eventually get hit, meaning that you just lose these. You can put them back up, you can get the stacks back up relatively quickly, but I feel that maybe losing like half of Gale Force would make this node at least used, because pretty much nobody takes this. I think it has like a 1% chosen rate on PoE Ninja for no matter where you go. So for defensive options, it's not really going to get a point. For offensive options, it has them in spades. It's got generic abilities that work for pretty much any Ascendancy that is using, you know, like bows or ranged abilities. It does have Rupturing. It's not really good, unfortunately. I think Rupturing needs a rework, but it's got Tailwind that you can get. Occupying Force is really good when people are trying to do like single target Toxic Rain stuff. Focal Point is a ton of damage. It's just generically good abilities that work for pretty much anyone that wants to come here, and also some pretty unique ones. So I think it gets a full point for offensives. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? A ton of them. Pretty much any bow type build, any projectile type build works absolutely perfectly with this Ascendancy. There's a ton of different styles of damage that you can use with it. Gets full points for that. Is it actually good? Does it get played? Yeah, it's a pretty popular Ascendancy, especially at the high end. Historically, it even had more builds that it was played with, specifically when like, you know, like Toxic Rain and things like that were good. I've seen some people try to make Rupturing work, but unfortunately Rupturing just doesn't really work with how bleed actually functions. Rupturing is like incentivizing you to attack faster and to crit, which neither of those things scale with bleed, so it's like, is it really worth it? So it's going to get a point for that just because there's a ton of builds that can actually use this Ascendancy. It's pretty varied. So overall, it gets a 4, and I've already kind of talked about fixing it. I think that they either need to like nerf Focal Point a little bit down, like the less damage taken, but make it so that it works on the marked enemy as well. Like bring it down to like 10 or 15% less damage taken, but make it everything, including the marked enemy. I think that would probably help a little bit. Maybe make it so that Wind Ward has like maybe lose 50% of your current stacks instead of all of them when you get hit. Maybe that can make this point worth taking at some point. And Rupturing just seems kind of bad. I think they just need to remake this from the ground up. I don't know. It just doesn't really seem like it makes any sense. Maybe they'll give us like a keystone or something sometime soon that makes it so that scaling crit with bleed actually makes sense, and then Rupturing will be good, but as it currently is. But Ascendancy gets a 4. It's a pretty solid Ascendancy. A lot of people use it. It's the big juicer bow Ascendancy. Pretty solid place. Now, moving on to the Pathfinder. Pathfinder is kind of a one-trick pony right now. There's only really one build that it functions for, and only really one archetype that it functions for. So when it comes to unique mechanics, I'm not going to give this Ascendancy a point just because it just has a lot of just the same stuff that anybody else can get. It's basically flask nodes. There's nothing here that you can't get elsewhere now, and the only real benefit that you get is just that your flasks are super powerful and you don't need to invest in them otherwise. Not really a unique mechanic. There are plenty of Ascendancies that can basically get full perma flask uptime, and it isn't really that unique, to be honest with you. This is just a lot of like flask good, essentially. The only kind of unique thing is that when you kill a poison enemy during any flask effect, nearby enemies are poisoned. The problem with this is that that's just not really that useful most of the time, in that most poison builds are going to be running Plague Bearer instead of their main ability for clear. So Plague Bearer just kind of clears better than this like poison proliferation does, so kind of not that great in my opinion. When it comes to defensive options, the Ascendancy does have some pretty good defensive options. The flask nodes are just really strong. Master Surgeon in and of itself recovering 6% of life whenever you use a flask, and how consistently this build can just spam flasks, increasing the effect of flasks, being able to use defensive flask, having them up constantly, reduced elemental damage taken with Nature's Boon, just like being able to move around faster, removing corrupted blood, removing bleeding, gaining a flash charge and deal critical strike, recovering a bunch of life. It's a pretty defensive Ascendancy. It works perfectly fine for defenses. You might have seen those videos where people are using, you know, Master Surgeon and just standing in the middle of like 500 mobs and they're just gaining infinite flash charges and recovering life constantly. Yeah, it's got defensive. Offensive options, it does have them. They're not really supported super well right now, but it does have them. The flask nodes do give you some offensive options in the sense that it does make it so that you can like attack and move faster. Having those flasks up consistently does give you some pretty good offenses. And it does have like some chaos damage nodes, which are okay, and some poison nodes, which are okay. It does have these elemental nodes, which don't really have a skill at work with them right now. I think ideally what they're wanting is they're kind of wanting these skills to work with, like, I don't know, like whatever the other concoction is. I know poisonous concoction, but explosive concoction, I think is what it's called. That ability is kind of a meme. I know there's a few people that have tried to play it, but I haven't really seen anything too promising. I think that is what this ability is kind of trying to work towards, and maybe Master Alchemist as well, but this con is a little bit weak, but it does have offensive options. They're just not really in the best spot right now, but that may not be the fault of the Ascendancy itself. It's probably just the fault of there not really being any skills that work too well with it that are good right now. Speaking of which, for the amount of builds, amount of archetypes that this Ascendancy can sustain, there's essentially only one ability that works with this Ascendancy right now, and beyond that, it's mostly just like weird meme builds. For the most part, it's poison, and that's pretty much it. And even then, most of the abilities that you're doing, it's not that great, in my opinion. The Pathfinder allows you to play Poisonous Concoction and like I think one other build. I don't remember what it is, but it is another poison attack. And that's all it's really ever been good at, is just simply poison attack builds. So it doesn't really allow you to do very much other than that. It's really only got one build that works for it right now, and that build can't really scale up that high without absurd levels of gear. So I can't really give it a point here. And then, is it actually good? Do people play it? Does it have numbers? I'm going to give it a full point here, mainly just because of that one build is played pretty frequently early on in the league. Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder is a good like transitionary build for a lot of things, and a lot of people do play it early on in the league. It's relatively popular. The build is okay for what it is. It's not a bad build, so I'm gonna give it a point there, but it really is close to not having a point there, like, or maybe a half a point, but I'm gonna give it a full point just because of how prominent that build currently is. So as for fixing it, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but the elemental section probably needs some work, whether that is just fixing explosive concoction and, you know, that just kind of makes it so that elemental stuff works, or if it just completely dumps the elemental nodes and goes more into flasks or more into poison or more into something else. I think that's kind of the path that the Pathfinder needs to take. So this is one of those ones where I think it actually needs like a developer to take a look at it and give it a little bit of a refresh. So overall, a 3 out of 5. Now when it comes to the Raider is interesting in that this is one of the least unique Ascendancies in the game, but I think that that makes it unique. Now let me explain. This Ascendancy gives you pretty much nothing that is hard to get elsewhere, but it gives you a lot of it. So when it comes to unique mechanics and it comes to things that this Ascendancy does give you, I'm giving it a half of a point, even though it has absolutely nothing unique about it, but that makes it unique. I think that it is okay to just have a pure stat stick Ascendancy that just gives you a bunch of powerful nodes and makes you go fast. I think that that's an okay thing for the game. That's what the Raider does. Makes you go fast, makes you take less damage, makes you do more damage. Just overall just kind of like a yeah, let's go do damage ascendancy. For defensive options, it has multiple defensive options that are available to this ascendancy. Avatar of the Chase gives you a ton of chance to evade attacks. This can take you from like 90% evade up to 95% evade if you want to take it. Beyond that, having phasing, 40% spell suppression is really powerful. 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments while phasing, very, very powerful defensive node. Being able to stack frenzy charges and get more evasion rating and more movement speed out of it does give you a bunch of defensive options, so it's going to get a full point for that. For offensive options, once again gets a point. You got the option to stack frenzy charges. You've got the option to get just like a bunch of movement speed and attack speed and cast speed through Rapid Onslaught and Avatar of the Chase. You can go Avatar of the Veil for like exposure. These aren't as good as the other options, but it's still there. It does give you 3 kind of different options to go offensive wise, so it's going to get a full point there. When it comes to build and archetypes that it can sustain, because it is such a generically just go fast speed, have good stats abilities, you can pretty much play whatever you want on it as long as it kind of fits into like frenzy charges or attack and cast speed, or you know, like moving and zooming. You can pretty much play your build as a raider and it works, so it's going to get a full point there. And is it played? Yeah, it's a pretty popular ascendancy. The numbers are there, the numbers are good. I think it's going to get a full point for playability and whether or not it's actually good, leaving it at a 4.5. Now, as for fixing this ascendancy, I don't really think there's much to fix here. I think it just is kind of as it is. You can't really make this ascendancy much better besides just like nerfing or buffing the numbers. I think its reliance on its numbers being good is a bit of a weakness, and that's a little bit of a worry. It's why I gave it a half point for uniqueness, because if the numbers on the Raider are bad, this ascendancy completely falls flat and it just doesn't really work. So that isn't a good thing, but all of the other things that it has going for it are all so good that it's hard to give it any bad marks. I think that maybe the Onslaught line could be improved a little bit, because like Avatar of the Chase is okay. It gives you a bunch of onslaught effect, but it is kind of a weak node and not a lot of people take it just because these defensive options are so good. And then frenzy charge stacking is just probably the way that you go about this ascendancy most of the time. But Avatar of the Chase isn't bad. Like the onslaught nodes are okay, but I think if anything needed a little bit of change, maybe it's this line, because there is a lot of sources of onslaught in the game right now. Now, moving on to the Slayer. An ascendancy that has a pretty particular purpose in this game. It's just unfortunate that that purpose and the archetype that it's kind of, you know, representing is just bad. And that's going to be the main problem with the Slayer. I think the Slayer is an okay ascendancy. The abilities it wants to use are bad. There's nothing you can really do about that. When it comes to unique mechanics, the Slayer absolutely has it. It's got like increasing base crit. It's got like a unique way to increase area or to increase like strike range. Scaling frenzy charges and endurance charges at the same time. Overleech, can't be stunned, can't be affected by bleeding. A unique, super powerful cull. It's got a bunch of unique mechanics that are interesting, and they're all super useful. Melee is just kind of bad right now, so it's going to get a full point for that. For defensive options, I actually think this is one of the main problems with the Ascendancy, at least at current, is that it has a bunch of powerful offensive options, but you can just steal one of those on a champion and you're good. And the champion has significantly better defensive options right now. The problem for the most part that I think the Slayer has is that its real defensive options right now are pretty much built into the worst line of the Slayer, which is the Leech line of the Slayer. And I think this is the crux of the problem with the Slayer in general, is that it kind of does rely on this Leech section to, you know, like do what it's supposed to do to be tanky. And honestly, there's so many other sources of Leech, and overkill damage as Leech's life just really isn't that good. The stun unaffected and unaffected by bleeding is really powerful. That's cool. Attack speed is cool. All that's fine. But really, when you go Slayer, you're trying to get Headsman. You're wanting that big cull. And then you take some other random nodes and maybe Brutal Fervor just because you have to. And that just really doesn't cut it anymore. So when it comes to defensive options, I definitely think it needs some changes. Comes to offensive options, has them in spades. I already talked about pretty much the fact that it's literally all offensive options except for this node. And even this node has a little bit of offense to it. Now, archetypes and builds that it can sustain, this is supposed to be like the premier, like big two-handed weapon melee, you know, ascendancy. It's got tons of options. You can play a whole bunch of builds with it. They're all available. They're all things that exist. Melee is just not good right now. So I'm going to give it a full point here just because it does have the potential to fulfill all of those things, but melee is just not good. It is what it is. Now, for the last point, is it actually good? Does it get played? Are the numbers okay? No, It doesn't get a point here at all. The problem being that this Ascendancy, if melee is going to continue the trend that it's always been of just being kind of bad or being just like a money sink that you can't really make very much use out of it. Like, look, the best strike ability in the game right now is a ranged ability. It's a strike that literally you attack from range. That's the reason why it's good. We're talking about Lightning Strike. Lightning Strike is a strike, but you attack from range. That's the reason why it's good. Cyclone is the other ability that people tended to use on the Slayer. Cyclone's been nerfed into the ground, and pretty much like the Shockwave Cyclone is like the last build that anybody even really plays on the Slayer. I think the Slayer, it just suffers from being too generically good at melee, and melee is just not good right now. So this is one of those Ascendancies where I think that melee as a whole needs mechanical changes, and then the Slayer would be really powerful. But if I had to choose what to do to fix this Ascendancy, I would say that you probably want to make the overkill, like damage leached as life, a completely different mechanic. Like either make it so that leech lasts significantly longer, give it some kind of unique leech mechanic that makes sense here. You can leave all the other stuff, it doesn't really matter, but overkill damage leeches life is just kind of gratuitous overkill at this point. It's like you already do so much damage that you reach leech cap most of the time. Anyways, overkilling leech, that doesn't really do anything. What I feel that they need to do is they need to either focus some nodes on making like strikes substantially more impactful or just melee in general more substantially impactful. I don't know what you could do, but I think there needs to be something here that just makes melee work again if they're not going to fix melee in general. So overall, Slayer gets a 3. It's an okay Ascendancy that just unfortunately it suffers because melee is kind of bad right now, but that's not really the fault of the Slayer completely. Next is going to be the Champion. Champion's one of the best Ascendancies in the game. Not even close. Easily top 3. Like not even somewhat close. This Ascendancy pretty much has it all. It's got multiple unique mechanics that you absolutely can't get anywhere else. 20 Fortify. The only other way to get Fortify is to play a melee build, and most of those melee builds can't stack up to 20 Fortify. You just get this permanently, all the time. On top of that, it's got First to Strike, Last to Fall, which gives the Adrenaline mechanic, super unique. Pretty much no one else has the Adrenaline mechanic. You've got a unique way to scale Impales through Master of Metal. You've got a just generically really good Aura node. You've got a bunch of nodes that make it so that, you know, enemies can't evade, and this does support like a team of people if you want. It's just an overall pretty unique Ascendancy with a bunch of interesting unique things to it. Defensive options, some of the best defensive options in the game, honestly. Once again, Fortitude, 20% less damage from hits. Inspirational, take a bunch of extra effectiveness of auras, and auras are really well used for defenses right now. It does just have a bunch of generic armor and evasion built into a lot of these nodes. Like you get 1,000 armor if you've impaled someone recently, you get 500 armor and evasion while fortified, and guess what? You're permanently fortified. You've got a ton of recovery whenever you go onto low life. You can have this on consistently if you use Petrified Blood, gives you 10% additional physical damage reduction, 10% reduced damage if you've taunted an enemy recently, 20% less damage for everybody else. I mean, it's kind of just got them. It's got good defensive options, absolutely. Offensive options also has a bunch of good offensive options. Already talked about them. Pretty much the entire Ascendancy has good offensive options. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? Pretty much anything. There are people playing spells, there are people playing attacks, there are people playing bows, there are people playing like chaos damage over time casters. The Ascendancy honestly like has too many good things going for it, and it worries me because I really don't want this Ascendancy to be nerfed. I want the other Ascendancies to be buffed, but I feel like the Champion's gonna get slapped next league, and it makes me really sad because I think it's a really cool Ascendancy. I think it's really powerful, really strong, really interesting, and I just worry because I know Inspirational is gonna get hit really hard. I know Inspirational is gonna get hit. Fortitude might get hit. It's gonna make me really sad. I hope that they buff like Master of Metal and maybe the taunt stuff if they're gonna nerf all this other stuff, but it's coming. It's coming. Is it actually good? Yeah, I don't think I need to say anything else. The only thing that I would quote unquote fix with this Ascendancy, since it is a 5 out of 5, is something personal. It's just something that I would like. Make it so that these impale nodes give just generic enchants to impale for everything, so you could support a spell impale build. We're kind of getting towards being able to play a spell impale build, but I'd really like for it to work, and I think that'd be super cool. And yeah, just give it generic chance to impale, because it's, you know, just give everything generic chance to impale while you're at it. GGG. If you're watching this video and you see these nodes that just a 10% chance to impale enemies on hit with attacks, just make a 10% chance to impale enemies on hit. Just do it. It'd be cool. It'd be really cool. Gladiator. Very sad Ascendancy. This is an Ascendancy that used to be really powerful, used to be really popular, and then they made one change that pretty much completely neutered the Ascendancy, and that was removing their versatile combatant node and giving whatever this garbage is. So when it comes to unique mechanics that this Ascendancy has, It really only has like one or two at most, and they're not really that unique. I'm gonna give the Gladiator a half point here just because Arena Challenger sources of more attack and movement speed are relatively rare, and this is easily one of the better nodes when it comes to all of the Duelist Ascendancies. That's why the other Ascendancies steal it with Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. But this Ascendancy is literally just this node. The only build that people really play on the Gladiator is like the CF build, and that's because like Gratuitous Violence and Blood in the Eyes is okay, and it kind of fits because, you know, you want to go fast and Arena Challenger makes you go fast. But other than that, literally the entire top half of this Ascendancy, like all the nodes above this right here, completely worthless. They don't do almost anything at this point. The unique mechanics get a half point. When it comes to defensive options, the block nodes are really bad. If I'm being honest with you, these block nodes are really, really, really bad. Like 10% chance to block attack damage, that's almost worthless. 10% chance, maximum chance to block attack damage, also pretty much worthless. It's really hard to get that much block. It doesn't matter if you've got like this 10% chance to block node, it's really hard to get that much block. And then like 10 to armor evasion per 1% chance to block attack damage. So even if you did manage to get like 85% chance to block, it's 850 armor and evasion rating with a maxed out block. Guess what? Just by existing, champion gets most of that. Just by existing, champion gets most of that. These nodes are just really, really genuinely bad, and there's no defensive options really down here at all. Outmatch and Outlast is pretty much completely worthless. You can take it mainly because you get like, you know, more physical damage and reduced physical damage taken at maximum frenzy charges, but it's really just not a great node. Not gonna cut it for defensive options. It gets a 0 for that. For offensive options, it's gonna get half a point because it does at least do something. Like the CF build that plays, you can kind of play it, and Arena Challenger is really powerful. Arena Challenger is kind of carrying this Ascendancy, as you can see, half a point. How many archetypes and builds can it play? One, and that build isn't even that popular anymore, and I think most people are moving towards playing like the Wander champion version instead. The Gladiator is a very sad boy that has almost nothing going for it anymore, and it definitely needs a reimagining. No points there. Is it good? Are the numbers good? No. It's very bad. The numbers are bad. There's only one like build that is even somewhat played on it. Fixing this Ascendancy, make it a dual-wield Ascendancy. Why is this not a dual-wield Ascendancy? It's literally only got one dual-wield node. If you look at these three Ascendancies, right, this is something that's always bothered me. The Slayer, big two-handed weapon, right? It's meant to be a two-handed weapon build. Kind of fulfills that fantasy pretty well. You play two-hand with this. Shield and sword kind of fulfills it, right? It's tanky, it's got some interesting nodes, it's got like, you know, like I recover and sustain myself. You've got like taunting, meaning like you've got a shield and you taunt people, you can do impale, whatever, right? Shield and sword makes sense. You can play it as a shield and sword build perfectly fine, or a shield and weapon, whatever you want to call it. Gladiator, meant to be the dual wield Ascendancy, right? You got sword, meant to be like a dual wielding Gladiator. It's got one dual wielding node. Most people that played this Ascendancy as the dual Ascendancy, and this as the shield and like board and sword Ascendancy. Doesn't really make very much sense to me. Most people that play this Ascendancy with a bow. Why can't we make this a specifically dual-wield Ascendancy? That's kind of what it's supposed to be, right? Why aren't these block nodes like specifically empowering dual-wielding? I don't know. Seems kind of strange to me. The way that I would fix it is make all of these block nodes be dual-wielding nodes instead. They can be dual-wielding block nodes. There's basically no Ascendancies that really enable dual-wield block right now. I tried to do it on the Steel Champ, and it honestly just didn't really work. It just wasn't as good as the other options. Make this a dual block Ascendancy. I think that'd be pretty cool. So overall, Gladiator gets 1 point out of 5, particularly because Arena Challenger's carrying it. The Ascendant. My least favorite Ascendancy in the game, if I'm going to be honest with you. I think the concept of the Ascendant is just really, really poor. I know why they do it, and I know that they're really sticking to, yeah, this is going to be like Jack of all trades, master of none. Well, unfortunately in PoE, it just makes you bad. The only thing that the Ascendant actually has is the fact that it can stretch the tree really well, and it's got a lot of access to jewel slots. The only thing that makes this Ascendancy really good, people don't really play it for any of the like hybrid mechanics or anything, because it's just like, well, if you want the stuff from like the Assassin, why don't you just play the Assassin? If you want the stuff from like, I don't know, the Chieftain, just play the Chieftain, it's just better. There's some interesting stuff in here, like the Inquisitor node is actually pretty decent. There's some stuff in here, but for the most part, this Ascendancy just kind of falls flat in my opinion. When it comes to unique mechanics, this is one of the major points that it does get, because it does have the unique ability to stretch the tree very well. That is absolutely extremely unique to this Ascendancy, and no one else can get it, and I don't think it's like very possible besides like being able to just get little pieces of that. Like for example, the new jewels that let you take some nodes around certain parts of the tree. I think that's interesting, but This Ascendancy does have that uniqueness, so it does get 1 full point there. When it comes to defensive options, really doesn't have it. It doesn't have very many good defensive options at all. Simply, that is the fault of most of these random small points just being worse than their counterparts, so doesn't really get any good defensive options from me. Offensive options falls into the same exact problem. The nodes that have counterparts to like the Hierophant, Inquisitor, Chieftain, those Ascendancies just do what the Ascendant would do better, so not really any point in giving it a point there. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? There's basically only like 1 or 2 builds, and that is like high investment meme builds, and I'm not going to call that like sustaining an archetype. I'm going to call that just like spending copious amounts of money at this point, so it doesn't get a point there for me either. Is it actually good? Does it have numbers? Is it played? Yeah, it gets a full point here, because the fact that it can stretch the tree and get so many jewel slots and things and just get like flask nodes and all kinds of stuff does enable some pretty high-end crazy builds like ward loop and things like that. But at this point, the Ascendant has basically been relegated to a high-end meme build that does just crazy stuff, and I guess that that's fine. But I think that if you wanted to fix the Ascendant, I believe that you should lean more into the tree stretching ability as well as jewel slots. I think instead of all these extra points that you get and stuff here, I think the Ascendant should just like get some extra jewels built into its Ascendancy, right? Why don't you just make it so the Ascendant has like a jewel slot in each of these different directions, right? Just give it an extra jewel slot there. That would be kind of cool. That would be kind of interesting. I know you're gonna say, but the Ascendant has all these jewel slots around here, and yeah, and people use those all the time. Just give it more. Who cares? I think that'd be kind of cool. If you're gonna make it a Ascendancy that only works with like degenerate meme builds, go full on degenerate meme build. Just give it a whole bunch of jewel slots. I don't know. Give it a large cluster jewel slot right in the middle. That'd be interesting, right? I think that'd be cool. 2 out of 5. I don't really know what to do with the Ascendant. Unleash potential. I've never even looked at this actually. Wow, that's bad. Is that the worst of all of the unique nodes that they got from the Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame? Increased endurance, frenzy, and power charge duration. 400%. Chance to gain a power, frenzy, or endurance charge on kill. So it's a 25% chance to gain 1 of those, and then 1 max of all. Wow, that's really bad. That's really bad, actually. Okay, anyways, moving on. The Juggernaut. A problematic Ascendancy in the sense that this Ascendancy is one of the best examples of really going super hard in a direction and completely and utterly failing at it. So this Ascendancy is designed to be just a giant wall of meat, right? It's literally meant to be a tank. It's meant to be tanky and take no damage and be able to live and, you know, probably not do a ton of damage itself. And guess what this Ascendancy ended up being? A really big high damage accuracy stack meme build Ascendancy. That's the only thing that this Ascendancy works for, because pretty much all of these 4 nodes, maybe Unbreakable's sort of okay, these 3 nodes are worthless. Unrelenting, Unflinching, and Unyielding, these are all terrible nodes. Endurance charges just don't really do enough, and it doesn't scale enough damage. Like, Juggernaut honestly needs a complete rework. I think that it needs to be completely remade. Let's go ahead and grade it. Unique mechanics. It's gonna get half a point here from me, and that's mainly just because Unstoppable exists. The fact that you cannot be slowed below base movement speed is unique to like this, Home's Roots, and then like Ephemeral Garb, I think is what it's called. And that's if you put it on like an Animate Guardian or something. I think that's the only ways to get this mechanic, so it's gonna get a half point. And also kind of because like the accuracy stacking node is pretty cool, but honestly, with Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame, just play a Berserker and just steal the Undeniable node, and you probably just have a better build because the rest of these nodes are such trash. So when it comes to defensive options, it's also going to get half a point because it does have some defensive options. Unbreakable's pretty cool. Unstoppable's pretty decent. These nodes are not the worst defensive options in the game, but there's like 5 other Ascendancies that are just tankier than this Ascendancy in general. So, I mean, half a point being kind of generous, but half a point because it does have some. When it comes to offensive options, it also gets half a point. This is me being very generous with it, and that's only because Undeniable exists. The rest of this doesn't really do anything for offenses, but this Undeniable node is actually pretty unique in this game, so I think it's pretty good. I think it deserves half a point. When it comes to how many archetypes that this build can sustain, the answer is 0 right now, because you just play Berserker and you steal the Undeniable node. So the amount of builds that it can sustain is 0, which is pretty unfortunate. Actually, no, you can play Bone Shatter, right? I guess you can play Bone Shatter. That's still not good. Having one build that barely functions with it, still probably not very good. And then is it good? Does it have numbers? No, it absolutely does not. So this Ascendancy gets a 1.5, and that's a generous 1.5. I think it should probably be closer to a 1, but I'm being generous. I'm being nice to the Juggernaut here, okay? It gets a 1.5. As for fixing it, I think that the way that this Ascendancy should work should lean more towards what Bone Shatter does, in that I think this Ascendancy should scale the damage that it does with the damage that it prevents. I think that that would be cool, making it like an Ascendancy that is meant to take or prevent a bunch of damage, and then that allows you to scale the damage that you do. I think this Ascendancy needs a complete rework, and I think that that would work pretty well for it. All right, and now we have the Berserker. So the Berserker is an interesting Ascendancy. This is the Ascendancy that I think they are wanting you to like deal more damage but be less tanky, and I think that's fine, but there's one little shift that I'd like to make with this Ascendancy. So unique mechanics that are difficult to get otherwise. This is the Rage Ascendancy. It's got one of the only real ways to sustain rage very easily that isn't like, you know, a complete meme at this point since Chainbreaker has been completely destroyed. It's got a unique defensive mechanic that's honestly never used, but I'll talk about how I think I can change this later. But it does have a bunch of very unique nodes, like this blitz charges that gives you more attack speed and reduced crit chance. It's just got like the biggest more damage node in the entirety of the game. Once again, the unique rage mechanic that is very difficult to get otherwise. Unique ways to interact with war cries and rage, as well as exerted attacks. Has a bunch of interesting and unique mechanics to it. So it does get a full point here. Defensive options, unfortunately, it doesn't get a point because the only defensive option that it's really got is Defy Pain, and Defy Pain is just kind of bad. The problem here is that 25% increased armor per Defiance really isn't enough when the like most used node out of the Berserker and like the big node out of the Berserker, it just makes you take 10% increased damage, but I'll talk about this again later. Offensive options, it has it in spades. It's got a big generic damage node. It's got Rage, which is really powerful. It's got Warbringer, which is good for any abilities that are using war cries. It's got crit, it's got good attack speed, bunch of different options for offensives, full point. As for archetypes and builds that it can sustain, there are quite a few builds that use the Berserker right now. You can play it as like a General's Cry build. You can play it as something like just a generic like attack build. There's some Lightning Strike Berserkers out there. There's a variety of builds that can work pretty well within this archetype. Now, is it actually good? Are the numbers there? Yeah, I do feel that it is pretty good right now. The one lacking feature that I think the Berserker has is some kind of defensives, but I know that most people think of the Berserker as like do big damage, take lots of damage, but I don't necessarily think that that's even required thematically. And let me talk about why. So in fixing the Berserker, what I would do is just kind of make a shift towards what I feel is more thematically to a Berserker. I personally don't think Berserkers historically, thematically, whatever you want to call it, should be taking more damage. I think they should be taking less damage. However, I feel that they should be losing life. Does that make sense? So the idea here of these like Rite of Ruin where you like lose life per second per rage, I think that makes more sense with a Berserker. Because when you think of like what a Berserker stems from, right? We're thinking like basically like Vikings that used to like take all kinds of crazy chemicals and mushrooms and eat whatever that made them go into like a psychotic rage, right? What I think is that typically if they're in that psychotic rage, they're probably just shrugging off most of the like actual pain and everything, right? You got this no like Defy Pain, right? Like that's fine. Like they're just shrugging off the pain. They shouldn't be taking more damage. However, that's at the cost of like their vitality, right? They are losing health, but they're not necessarily getting hit harder, right? They're shrugging that pain off. They're not worrying about it. So what I think you could do to make the Berserker a little bit better is that move it more into losing life and taking a little bit less damage. You can make it something like Defy Pain is, instead of increased armor per Defiance, make it like DR, like pure damage reduction per Defiance. Make it go up to 10 to counteract the amount of DR that, you know, Aspect of Carnage gives, and it could just scale like back and forth over the course of time. I think even just that little change would help. Also, I think that Blitz doesn't really fit super well in with the Ascendancy. I think that this is an Ascendancy that has a bunch of options that, you know, incentivize you to use like big powerful attacks, but this Blitz is like you're losing crit chance and gaining more attacks. It just doesn't really fit super well. I think this could use some work, but I'm not exactly sure how to fix it. So Berserker gets an overall 4 out of 5. Pretty good Ascendancy. The Chieftain is a very unfortunate and disappointing Ascendancy. It does a couple things relatively okay, but it doesn't do any one particular thing well, and it kind of is a lacking Ascendancy in my opinion. When it comes to the unique mechanics that are difficult to get otherwise, the only reason that this Ascendancy is getting half a point is because of Toa for strength. This just doesn't exist elsewhere at all, and it is a very unique, like, extra slam ability that can happen, so it's hard for me to give 0 points when this is literally just completely unique and nothing else has even anything close to it. So that's the only reason it gets half a point there. Honestly, the rest of this Ascendancy is just a bunch of random stats thrown on here. This is the only unique thing. Like, the rest of this is just like some totem stats, some defensive stats, some totem stats, some endurance charge stats, more stats, more stats, more stats. It's got cover rare unique enemies in Ash, which is kind of cool, I guess. That's sort of unique. But yeah, it's just Toa strength. For defensive options, it does have a few different decent defensive options, such as like fire resistance, as well as like physical damage taken as fire. This is actually a pretty powerful node, if I'm gonna be honest with you, and the recovery rate, if you've taken fire damage, is okay. Unaffected by Ignite is also pretty good. The Endurance Charge node is okay. It also has some fire damage leached as life. This is the fire damage ascendancy. So it does have some options. Like, it's got some decent stuff for defenses, but none of them are really that super powerful. The problem here is they're all kind of disjointed. It's like physical damage taken as fire is fine, but you have to invest really heavy into making that like super worthwhile. The endurance charge stuff is okay, but it's really only regenerating in life, and it doesn't actually make you take any less damage or anything. And then the fire damage thing is once again just like regenerating life. It doesn't actually make you take less damage. I'm only going to give it half a point here because the defensives unfortunately aren't super useful. This is by far the best defensive node that it's got. This is pretty much carrying the defenses of it. It doesn't really have any other real defensive options. When it comes to offensive options, once again, it does have a bunch of like random offensive options, but there's nothing really special here, if I'm going to be honest with you. Closest thing to being special is like the Toa's Chosen and some of the totem node stuff. But like this converting fire damage and gaining a bunch of extra fire damage every once in a while and strength, there's not really a lot here. There's like some interesting stuff like strength stacking stuff and some totem stuff and some like slam stuff and all of that. So I'm gonna give it half a point, but there genuinely just isn't enough here. There's just a bunch of stats thrown in at Ascendancy and nothing really unique that kind of ties it all together. Basically, if you're wanting to do Ignite, Elementalist is just better at that. If you're wanting to do like on-hit fire damage, the Inquisitor is just better at that. This Ascendancy just doesn't really have anything. It basically has like things that can strength stack and do totems at the same time kind of work, and that's really not much of an identity, to be honest with you. It's not really many offensive options. So half a point for offensive options, and that ties into identity. It's got like a build that works for it. Like it's basically like slams, right? Like there's like Tectonic Slam and like Tectonic Slam totems, or you know, Consecrated Path totems. Pretty much it. It's not really much of an identity. Doesn't get a point for that. Is it actually good? Are the numbers good? Do people play it? No. This is one of the bottom played Ascendancies. Not really much of a point, so no, it doesn't get a point for that. So 1.5 overall. Fixing the Chieftain, it needs something that identifies it as the Chieftain. And I feel that one thing that this Ascendancy could do is this could be the fire on hit Ascendancy, right? This could be the Ascendancy that focuses on doing fire damage of all kinds and hitting fire damage of all kinds. Now, how do you do this? Well, you make the Ascendancy scale with Scorch. You could just make this Ascendancy have unique ways to scale Scorch, unique ways to apply Scorch, whatever it might be, and make it so this Ascendancy can focus on that in particular. It would make it the de facto like on-hit fire Ascendancy, because Scorch is a very powerful mechanic. It's really hard to get most of the time, and it could be something that could give this Ascendancy a big boost that it needs. It would still allow the Elementalist to be the Ignite Ascendancy. You could still do like fire damage stuff on the Inquisitor, but it would give the Chieftain more of a reason to exist, right? Scale that Scorch very heavily, scale non-damaging elemental ailment effect very effectively on this build. I think that could be pretty cool. But yeah, besides that, Chieftain doesn't really have a lot going for it. Now we move on to my favorite Ascendancy in the game. I talked about this at length in my previous video, but I'll go over things pretty quickly once again, because this is like the Ascendancy that I really honed in on. But if you haven't watched that video, at least you'll know something. So when it comes to unique mechanics, I think that the Inquisitor has a ton of very unique mechanics that can be used most of the time. So for example, we have a way to scale crit off of intelligence and strength, and on top of that we have a way to use that crit to completely ignore elemental resistances on monsters. This is very unique because there's not a lot of other Ascendancies in the game that give you anything even close to this. There's not a lot of other effects in the game that give you anything close to this, and it makes it so that you have like a choice, right? If you take this node, you scale crit and only crit. Curses are very difficult to like choose a good curse anymore. You basically have to choose like a mark or a defensive curse. It makes it so that things like exposure are no longer useful. It makes you make specific choices and change the way that you play the game. And it's also very powerful at the same time. And then we've got, you know, Sanctuary and Pious Path. This is relatively unique to the Inquisitor, being able to always have Consecrated Ground and have that Consecrated Ground recover you in a hybrid manner, both energy shield and life. This enables Righteous Fire. It enables you to go a hybrid build. It enables you to go like Petrified Blood low life. very powerful Ascendancy line. And then we have Instruments of Virtue, Instruments of Zeal. This is the weakest of all of the like Ascendancy parts, but it is still unique and interesting. Battle Mage is hard to obtain in this game. There's only a few sources of it, and they're mainly on like weapons that aren't very good most of the time. It makes it so that you can kind of do like a hybrid scaling of like your weapon damage with your spells and such. And then Instruments of Zeal, probably the weakest node on the Inquisitor, but I did find a use for it. It is at least able to be used. I used like a Spellslinger Inquisitor build, which made pretty good use of this, which was pretty interesting. It made it so that you can attack consistently and get a bunch of extra cool stats off of it. There's not very many other things in the game that just give you like 75% reduced generic cost of all abilities. Pretty good node, pretty interesting node, just doesn't have a lot of uses at current time. And then of course, you've just got the one generic nodes like take less damage, do more damage, fine, right? Bunch of unique things on the Inquisitor, so it gets a full point there. Comes to defensive options, we've got generic take less damage, we've got, you know, recovery, hybrid recovery. This makes curses less effective on you. We have multiple defensive options that you can choose. I would say it's a little weaker in like the amount of choices that you get, but Pious Path and Sanctuary is such a strong defensive layer that it's kind of hard to not give it a point here. I would say that is one of the other small weaknesses of the Inquisitor, but it does get a full point just because these nodes are so powerful. And of course, you do have a just generic take less damage node, right? For offensive options, it's got a offensive line here, an offensive line here, and even the defensive line gives you an offensive option through Righteous Fire. This is also a generic offensive option, so pretty good on offense, gives you a point there. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? Right now it's mainly popular because of Righteous Fire, but it does like enable physical spell builds. You can go like caster based builds, you can sort of go attack builds, but they're not super useful on the Inquisitor. It does have a generic just any kind of elemental build that you can play, this Ascendancy can, you know, pretty much sustain it. So it does get a point there as well. Is it actually good? Is it played? Are the numbers there? Yeah, it's one of the most popular Ascendancies in the game at the moment. It's got a couple good builds that work for it, both high-end builds, early-end builds, and everything kind of in between. So it does get a point there. As I said previously, the only really things that you could fix on this would be making the Instruments of Zeal a little bit easier to use. I think that maybe if you could change the way that you gain fanatic charges and make it a little bit easier to gain them, like maybe don't put a time limit on them, maybe make it so that if you do 4 attacks you can have that up, or you just attack a couple of times real quick and then you have fanaticism again, could make this more useful. Other than that, I mean, maybe you could give like another defensive option into Instruments of Virtue, Instruments of Zeal, something like maybe a little bit of DR or something here, just make it so that there's some other option. Other than that, I think the Ascendancy is pretty good. It gets a 5 out of 5 for me. So talking about the Hierophant. The Hierophant is an Ascendancy that used to be really good. It used to be really solid, and that was mainly because it fit the meta very well of just abilities and types of scaling that were really powerful at that time. But since those have been nerfed, it's kind of hard to justify playing this Ascendancy for the most part. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad because of that. It has other problems that I think have always been there, but it's one of those situations where the archetype itself has been nerfed so insanely heavily that the Ascendancy can't really carry it anymore. And I think it needs more unique and interesting things to make it so that it could carry those, you know, abilities and stuff. So talking about unique mechanics, I'm going to give it a half a point just because it does have some interesting mana scaling. It's got some interesting totem stuff, and it does have like minimum charges. This is relatively unique. It's got like the brand stuff, which no other Ascendancy has anything having to do with brands. Plus 1 extra totem is really powerful. Totem placement speed is relatively unique. Being able to regenerate the life of totems pretty easily is relatively unique. And then it of course has like Transfiguration of Mind, Mana Reservation. This is all relatively sort of unique stuff that's hard to get elsewhere, but none of it is like super special. None of it is like really powerful or anything like that. So I can only really give it a half point. When it comes to defensive options, I do think that this Ascendancy has quite a few good defensive options. Problem is just that those particular archetypes have been nerfed so heavily that you might be like, well, the Ascendancy has like no defensive option. Yeah, it's because mana is just not good right now. Like mana as a defensive option is just not really great. I am going to give it a full point for that because I do think that it has multiple different ways to defend yourself. They are solid defensive options, just the numbers just really aren't there. You can go like Mind Over Matter, mana scaling. You've got like the Arcane Surge effect, which makes you a little bit tankier, recover life, reduced effective ailments. You've got some of the recovery stuff from totems. You've got like the minimum endurance charges as well as like additional maximum charges. It does have some options. It's just this archetype doesn't work very well, and I'm going to keep saying that over and over again through the entirety of this. Offensive options, though, I feel this is where this Ascendancy is lacking pretty heavily. I think that this Arcane Surge line is complete garbage. I know that Arcane Surge works well with mana, but this Arcane Surge line is garbage, and I'll talk about maybe fixing it later. Beyond that, we've got this just like one random brand node here, which is brand recall has increased coverage rate and like 100% more activation frequency of 75% attack. What is this node? This is like the most worthless node I think I've ever seen. Like, what is the point of having this node? Like, yeah, it makes it so that if you leave a brand on an enemy, it like activates more towards the end of it, but it's like, this node just is very out of place in my opinion. It's almost like they just wanted to put a brand node somewhere. They're like, well, I guess the Hierophant can have it. Toss a brand node on there. I don't know. I don't really like this node. I think that there needs to be like an actual full brand section for this Ascendancy. I think making this like the mana totem brand Ascendancy is fine if that's what they want to do. Like make it focused more around mana, but give some more brand love here, because honestly, this is just kind of a joke of a node, if I'm gonna be real with you. The totem nodes have kind of been neutered. Unfortunately, totems aren't really that great right now. They don't really do very much here. +1 max totem is okay, but more damage per summon totem is really not as cool as what a lot of other Ascendancies get. I just don't really feel like we have any good offensive options here. This line is completely trash. I guess minimum power charges is something, but you know, you can get those elsewhere. Power charge generation typically isn't hard for builds that are focusing on power charges, so not going to give a point to offenses. It's just falling short in too many different ways. Now, how many archetypes and builds can it sustain? Quite a few, actually, when these archetypes are good. If we've got like things like, you know, mana scaling for damage with spells, as well as totems, as well as brands, there's a lot of different things that this Ascendancy could sustain, and it has sustained very well in the past. But unfortunately, just none of those things are good right now. I am going to give it a full point there because, you know, it is able to do them. It's just those abilities have been nerfed so insanely heavily that kind of hard to, you know. Now, is it actually good? Does it have the numbers? Does it get played? No. Pretty much nobody is playing this. It has some of the numbers, but the numbers have kind of been nerfed. Like, they nerfed the totem nodes for some reason. No one has ever played totems. Like, there was like one league where people played totems, and that was 3.15 because they literally nerfed everything into the ground. And Forbidden Right totems were basically just like the only build that worked. But besides that, I mean, mana has been nerfed into the ground, totems have been nerfed into the ground, brands have been nerfed into the ground. Everything that this Ascendancy used to do has just been completely destroyed by GGG. So it's like, unfortunately, no one really plays it. It doesn't have enough numbers to be able to sustain those playstyles in and of itself, so can't give it a point there. That leaves it at a 2.5. My changes for this Ascendancy, if I were trying to fix it, I would honestly combine Arcane Blessing and Illuminated Devotion into one node. Like, just put everything from here all into one node. It's still not going to be that strong. But put this all into one node, move it over into the mana side, and then move this brand node over here and give us a full brand line, right? Make Sign of Purpose not pointless and give us like a big, unique brand mechanic. Like, +1 attached brands, and like enemy takes, I don't know, like enemy takes more damage or something, or deals less damage per brand that has attached to it. Something like that, right? Make this a cool brand Ascendancy and buff the totem nodes a little bit. If you do those two things, I think it'll probably be okay. It would be enough to where you could make use of the mana nodes here, because these mana nodes aren't bad, but there's not really any point in doing mana scaling at the moment. So if you gave some more unique mechanics to this Ascendancy, it'd probably have a reason to scale mana. So Hierophant gets a 2.5 just because it's kind of suffering from the fact that its archetype is just not good right now. Now we got the Guardian. Guardian's kind of an interesting class. I feel that the Guardian is literally just like, hey, let's make a support class and just toss a whole bunch of buffs on it and hope that things work. And that's what they did. It really doesn't have anything unique. It's just got like a bunch of just random buffs on it. There's almost nothing unique to this class. I actually think it's just like a complete weird mix match of just random stuff. Like, what is this? Like, block and intimidate, unnerve, attack speed, area of effect, elemental resistance, onslaught for nearby enemies, reduced effect of curses, regenerate life, armor on, like, what is this? There's nothing super unique here. The closest thing to a unique node would be Radiant Faith, right? It grants armor equal to percentage of reserved life to you and nearby allies, and energy shield for reserved mana. This is the closest thing to a unique node. Realistically, I would say that it gets a half point just because of Radiant Faith as well as Unwavering Faith. Just giving stats to your allies is pretty decent, but that's pretty much all it does. The rest of this stuff is just like weird generic stats and like stuff that they've thrown onto this Ascendancy. I don't know, it feels very strange. Defensive options, this is the one thing it does pretty well. It's got a lot of defensive options. Pretty much all of the nodes are defensive options if we're being realistic here. Like, let's look. So physical damage reduction, life, that's defensive. Armor, energy shield, that's defensive. Nearby enemies cannot gain power, frenzy, or endurance charges. That's defensive. You and your nearby party members share those charges, and you gain power, frenzy, and endurance charges. That's some offense, some defense. And then we've got Time of Need, reduced. That's defensive. We've got Radiant Crusade. Onslaught is offensive, but it also has elemental resistance. That's defensive. Block is defensive. Nearby enemies get area of effect. This is actually the only purely offensive node in the entirety of the thing. And movement speed is even kind of defensive. So, you know, pretty much every node has some layer of defense to it. So yeah, I mean, it gets a full point for defensive. That's essentially what the Ascendancy does. Offensive option, power frenzy charges, onslaught, intimidate, unnerve. No, not really great. It's nearby allies too. You don't even get it yourself. It's like nearby allies have to do it for you. Yeah, it's like all built into like nearby allies. So yeah, it doesn't get a point for offensive. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? The thing about this, and I know this is going to feel a little wishy-washy and weird when I say this, but I am going to give it half a point, even though there's basically only one build that this can really sustain. And the reason for that is because if I go by the exact definition of builds that it can sustain, this enables a lot of party play, which enables a lot of other kinds of builds. So I have to give it something, right? Pretty much as a Guardian, it's kind of like a minion Ascendancy besides that. You can play like Absolution, sort of. You can play like, I don't even remember the name of Dominating Blow and things like that. You can sort of play those Ascendancies. So I'm going to give it half a point, because it at least does something, but none of those like actual like you play the build options are that great. And this was one of the Ascendancies that used to have one of the worst feeling builds that I've ever seen in my entire life, and that was like the Cyclone Herald of Agony build. Man, that was such a miserable build. If you played that and you enjoyed that, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Is it actually good? Do people play it? Does it have numbers? I'm gonna give it half a point here, because yeah, people play it, but only really as like, you know, either a worse minion build or as a party play kind of thing. So it gets half a point. That leaves the Guardian at 2.5. Fixing it, I think you should make this Ascendancy be focused on having a very few amount of very powerful minions. I think that if you can make this Ascendancy be really good for abilities like Reaper or abilities like Absolution, Dominating Blow, things like that, if you could really make it work when you have a small amount of monsters, like the less minions you have, the more powerful it makes them. I think this could be a pretty good Ascendancy beyond that. And now we arrive at what a lot of people are hoping that, man, we yelled at Big Ducks about not liking this Ascendancy. Hopefully we've been able to change his mind. Not really, if I'm gonna be honest with you. I still feel the same way about the Cultists as I did before, but maybe I can explain what I was thinking and feeling a little bit better this time. Let's talk about the Occultist. The Occultist is an above average Ascendancy. I don't actually think it's that good. I think it's just sustaining itself off of its raw power, which I think is dangerous for an Ascendancy, because if they nerf that raw power, it has nothing that really is going for it to keep people playing it. I also think that the bottom line here, Void Beacon, Withering Presence, and Frigid Wake are all really bad. I think that these are some of the worst Ascendancy points out of the whole mix of what the Occultist has, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Unique mechanics that are difficult to get otherwise. This is my main thing that I don't like about the Occultist. It does not have any unique mechanics that are difficult to get otherwise. This is essentially just sustaining off of random stats, right? If you look at these nodes, Forbidden Power is literally just like area, damage, maximum power charge, way to gain power charges. While Bastion has stun immune, it's okay. This is cold damage and like taking some less damage. This is just generic damage, reduced life regeneration. Once again, you can get that through, you know, having like Frost Bomb. Withering Presence, chaos resistance and more chaos damage, really generic. Hexes can affect hexproof enemies. I know a lot of people seem to think that this is like some really super insanely powerful mechanic, but the thing about it is the only reason why you think that this is so strong is because your Explodey relies on the enemies not being hexproof. A lot of people have said, yeah, this is such a powerful mechanic, like hexproof is so important. And let me be real with you, it's only important for this Ascendancy. Hexproof is not a very common modifier, it's relatively rare on map mods, and for every other build in the game that isn't revolving around having their main clearing mechanic, the enemies have to be cursed, Hexproof is like, oh, I do a little bit less damage. It's really not that big of a deal. The only reason that you think that this is as powerful as it is because your main clearing mechanic relies on it. That's why I think that people think that that's powerful. I don't think this is interesting. This is Explodey and a way to make sure that you are guaranteed to have that Explodey. But all other sources of Explodey don't need that. This is like making a problem and then solving it, right? As for Malediction, Malediction is pretty good, but it's generically good. Increased effective curses, additional curse, and Malediction. Now, people took this as like a direct attack on their lives that I was making because I said that I didn't like the way that this Ascendancy is made. And I don't really understand that. There's always going to be ascendancies that just have generic power and that are just more powerful than the other ones, and that's fine. There's been plenty of them that exist in the game. There's literally an ascendancy that is designed around that, which is the Raider. And those are always going to exist. But does it really matter if you're playing Occultist versus something else? I mean, if you're just playing this ascendancy just because it's powerful and has a lot of stats, that's cool. But if they nerf those stats, this ascendancy is just not really going to be played anymore. This ascendancy was completely ignored for years, and the only reason why people really moved over to it is because they nerfed Assassin so much. And they found out that you could scale, you know, some pretty good AoE with power charges and such. If they nerfed Forbidden Power pretty heavily, I bet a large percentage of people would stop playing this ascendancy. To give you an idea, the vast majority of people that actually play Occultist right now are playing it because of Forbidden Right, and there are a few other builds that work relatively well with the Occultist, but let's actually rate it, since you obviously know I'm giving it a 0 points for unique mechanics, because I really don't think this ascendancy is that unique. Now, when it comes to defensive options, I do have to give it a full point here. It does have multiple different ways to, you know, scale defenses. You've got less damage taken from Malediction, you've got like some energy shield recovery and such here, you've got chaos resistance in this node, you can like freeze nearby enemies, cannot be shield, cannot be frozen. It does have multiple different defensive options, so I do have to give it a full point there. For offensive options, it also has a bunch of offensive options. It's got Malediction, additional curses, and more damage. It's got Profane Bloom, gives you a good source of clear. It's got a way to stack very high levels of damage and area of effect through power charges. It's got some chaos damage and some cold damage. These are pretty generic nodes, but it does have those options available to you, so it does get a full point for offensive. When it comes to how many archetypes and builds it can sustain, reluctantly do have to give it a full point here as well, because it does allow a decent amount of different builds. Even though it's Forbidden Right that's carrying the vast majority of people that are playing this ascendancy, it does have some other options. Like you can go some cold builds. There's like the cold damage over time abilities that work relatively well with this ascendancy. Used to be one of my, you know, like favorite builds of all time, which is Creeping Frost. It does have some build options, right? Like you can play like Cold Blade Vortex, the cold damage over time abilities. You can play Forbidden Right. There are options for this build, right? Cast on crit. I think that it's fine, right? Like, I think that it does have a variety of options. I just don't think it's a very interesting ascendancy is the problem. Now, is it powerful? Is it good? Do people play it? Yeah, it does absolutely get a point there. And that puts this ascendancy at 4 out of 5. Now, just because an ascendancy gets a 4 out of 5 does not necessarily mean that I want to see more ascendancies like this. And I think that that's the thing that people took wrong. They were acting as if I thought it was like a bad thing to have this ascendancy in the game, and I don't necessarily feel like having these style of ascendancies in the game is bad. I just don't want a lot more of them. I don't think they're very interesting, and I think they prevent us from playing more in different builds, because if this build is so powerful, it's hard to really rationalize playing other ones, right? I would much rather see other ascendancies that have interesting and unique mechanics in them that allow us to do all kinds of cool stuff, but like kind of forces us to go outside of the box instead of just being like, well, guess I'm playing an Occultist again this league. All right, here we go. Let's go Occultist, right? I kind of want something more like that, right? Now, talking about fixing it, I think that the main thing that could be done with the Occultist is that, honestly, and I know you might hate me for this, I think you just get rid of Forbidden Power. I don't think it really fits very much. I think it encroaches too much on the Assassin's style of scaling. I think you get rid of Forbidden Power completely. I think that you also get rid of Void Beacon completely. I think that you remove these two nodes and you make a dedicated Chaos line and a dedicated Cold line. Now, what would you be doing with those dedicated Cold and Chaos lines that would be more interesting compared to what everything else that exists in the game? So there's not an ascendancy that does anything with Brittle. There's also not really another ascendancy that does anything with Wither. I think it'd be interesting to make this ascendancy, and it is kind of thematic that you would be debuffing enemies with the Occultist, right? It's like the curse and hexes and all that kind of stuff. So if you made this ascendancy be very powerful for like Brittle as well as very powerful for Wither, you could make it so that you could scale Brittle, and that would give you like that crit effect, right? It would give you like what Forbidden Power sort of does, gives you like power charges and such. You could still scale crit through Brittle on the Occultist. You could also make it so that the effect of Brittle also affects like damage over time of cold abilities taken. That would enable that kind of style or that archetype to work well again, you know? And on top of that, there's pretty much no other ascendancy in the game that I can think of that does anything super unique with Wither. So if you could make Wither more powerful and make it, you know, so that maybe Wither from this ascendancy is just permanent, it just lasts forever no matter what. like Eternal Withering or something. I don't know, I suck at making names. But just give some more love towards some like alternate mechanics that we don't really have very much of. I think it would be thematic. I think it would be much more interesting than just like nearby enemies have minus cold and chaos resist. You could probably keep the minus chaos resist in here because it's pretty hard to get minus chaos resist. Just bake it into one of the other chaos nodes. I think that'd be a good way to go about it. Maybe like minus chaos resist per wither on the enemy or something like that. I think could be more interesting than just like, yeah, nearby enemies have less chaos resistance. It would make it so that you could stay at range as well. I think that'd be a lot cooler than just like these generic nodes with a bunch of just percentage damage and random stats on them. So now moving on to the Elementalist. So the Elementalist is an interesting ascendancy. It kind of is one of the more popular ascendancies of all time, and I think that's specifically because of a thematic thing. People like the idea of playing a caster. This is like the thematic caster. When you start the game, you want to play a caster. Oh, well, the witch seems like what's going to be like the caster, right? And then you start out with Fireball, and a lot of people like playing just like random caster abilities. This seems like the caster premier ascendancy, right? Unfortunately, as are many things in PoE, it's pretty misleading because this is not the premier caster ascendancy. When it comes to unique mechanics that are difficult to get otherwise, that's one of the main strengths I feel of this ascendancy at this point, and that is because of being able to ignite pretty much anything, the golem buff nodes, as well as like, you know, the chill and shock nodes. These are all very hard mechanics to get elsewhere. Problem here is that these two are kind of not really that good, and these two are kind of a little bit too generic for my like. Talk about more of that later. It does get a full point for unique mechanics though. When it comes to defensive options, it does have some defensive options. Chilling enemies is okay. Like Bastion of Elements is okay. The golem nodes actually provide a decent amount of tankiness, but it's not really very many options if I'm going to be real with you. I'm only going to give it a half point just because it does have some stuff, but these are very weird defensive options if I'm going to be real. Like the golem nodes, the idea that you just use these golems for their buffs only kind of makes me sad. I'm going to give it a half point here. When it comes to offensive options, got a ton of offensive options. The golem node gives you buffs. That Shaper of Flames makes you do a ton of damage with ignites, and you can scale it pretty much any way you like. You've got a bunch of exposure, you've got a bunch of just like area of effect and more elemental damage, and then you've got like being able to shock people more. It's got offensive options, so it gets a full point there. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? Ignite and some meme golem builds. That's pretty much it. So currently there's only really one ignite build that people are playing, and that's Explosive Arrow Ballista. Doesn't really make it so that it's got very much going for it. If the two builds that the Ascendancy can really sustain right now are Explosive Arrow Ballista and like a meme exploding golem build, can't really give it a point if I'm gonna be honest with you, so it doesn't get a point here. Is it actually good? Are the numbers good? Is it played? Yeah, this is mainly sustaining itself off the fact that EA Ballistas is so powerful as an ignite option, because besides that, it wouldn't really have a ton else going for it. Once again, golem's kind of okay, but it does get a full point just because it's basically the most popular build in the game right now. Like that and RF are some of the more popular builds that exist right now. Kind of hard to not give it a point, so it ends up at a 3.5. I think that the Elementalist is an ascendancy that needs a lot of fixing, but it doesn't need a lot of like new mechanics. I think it just needs these mechanics that we have here to be refined a little bit. This ascendancy has just been absolutely shoehorned into being an ignite only ascendancy. That's all that people really care about, and then like the explodey golem thing, that's sort of okay. But honestly, I'm gonna be real with you, I think these golem nodes are hurting more than they're helping. Actually, I think these golem nodes are problematic, and let me kind of explain why. The golem nodes, what these do is they kind of just turn the golems into buff bots. You know, they're just like mobile buff totems, essentially, is what they are. And I would like to see more emphasis on making the golems be damaging mobs again. I think having alternative summoners, alternative ways to be a summoner instead of like just basically playing like a Necromancer with the same exact mobs every single time. I think alternative ways to be a summoner would be good for the game. I think it would be interesting if these golem nodes actually made the golems like more worth it to scale damage. Because if you look at these golem nodes, right, it's like increased effective buffs. Golems are resummoned after being killed. It's summon golems are immune to elemental damage. Increased effective buffs granted by the golem. It's literally just buffs. Yeah, you get more maximum golems, and that's cool, but it's literally just buffs. I think the buffs are fine, but move the buffs into one node, and then make the other node actually like make the golems do some damage. One of my favorite builds of all time was a stone golem build, right? I loved that build. I thought it was cool. But now, I mean, basically for a stone golem build, you take the buff nodes and it makes the golems, tanky and makes you like, take less damage. You take Bastion of Elements, and then you take like Shaper of Storms so you can make the enemy shocked to do more damage. I mean, make it so that you could actually have like a golem line on here. These nodes are kind of whatever. They're sort of cool for lots of builds and they're fine. I think Bastion of Elements is kind of weird, but Make the golem nodes better. GGG. Oh, also, I think that you should do more with Shaper of Storms. Make it so that like recurring shock, like you could just like stack shock to where you keep hitting the enemy over and over and over again. It could stack more damage, like on hit lightning damage. I think that could be pretty cool, because currently this is kind of just used as a like, well, I'll just use this so that shocks always shock, and anything that I do shocks, right? Not really super useful. Overall, 3.5 out of 5. Mainly carried by EA Ballistas. And now the last Sensei that we're going to talk about, Necromancer. A lot of people disagreed with me on Necromancer, but I think that we agree, we're just looking at it different ways. So the thing about the Necromancer is this is always the Ascendancy that people talk about being too powerful, right? If we look at the entire scope of all the Ascendancies in the game, the Necromancer is much more powerful than a lot of the other Ascendancies. It's got very powerful mechanics, it's got unique mechanics, it's got interesting defensive options, interesting offensive options, and it just, people are like, well, it's too good for minions, it's too good for this, it's too good for that. It's like, well, I disagree. I disagree for the reason that I don't think that the Necromancer has too much. I think that everything else has too little. The way that I feel that you can make the Necromancer more fair seeming is that when it comes to the minion aspect of it, let's talk about that first. When it comes to minions, the Necromancer, I think it's fine that the Necromancer is like the Legion army of zombies and skeletons and stuff. I think it's fine that that's the best Ascendancy for this, right? I think that that's okay. Like, I think that there will thematically be some Ascendancies that are just better at one thing than others, right? However, why not make it so that like you can play a summoner build of other kinds, right? Make it so that summoners with golems are more powerful, right? Make the Elementalist a golem type build. Make it so that summoners with the Guardian with like a small amount of summons are really powerful. Maybe you can make like a Spectre based Guardian that just buffs the Spectres really, really powerfully and makes them super strong, but that's all that you use. Maybe make something along the lines of being able to have the Chieftain carry his totems on his back and then be able to slam while he runs around or something like that, right? It just give us more and different minion options instead of it just being like, well, the Necromancer is the best, so obviously it needs to be nerfed, right? It's too powerful, it's doing too much. Well, just make the other Ascendancies be able to keep up with it. That's my opinion on it. I don't actually think this Ascendancy is too powerful. I think it's just maybe standing out amongst its lesser powerful peers. So let's talk about the Necromancer. Unique mechanics, has them in spades. We've got offering skills being able to affect you, super powerful. It's got a unique scaling mechanic with corpses that makes it so that you can cast and attack much faster with corpses. Also scales the effectiveness of those corpses, gives like a source of chill and shock and all kinds of other stuff, reduced damage taken, has a bunch of unique corpse mechanics, has a unique skill that defends your minions if you're looking for something like that. It also just has some generic, like, make minions more powerful. It also does have just like, you know, a generic node that does some good things for everybody around you. And then it's got like a unique corpse-based scaling of energy shield and mana mechanics. So I think it's got a bunch of unique stuff going around for it. So it gets a full point there. Defensive options also gets a full point because it's got Mistress of Sacrifice, some good defenses there. You can do Bone Offering and have full block just because of this one node. You've got Bone Barrier, means that you and your minions are going to be able to be pretty tanky. Gives some reduced physical damage taken, increased recovery rate, makes your minions have more life, which is pretty solid. You've got Essence Glutton, which is going to give you energy shield recovery, and then you got Commander of Darkness, which is just some generic defenses. 30 all resist is pretty good. So full points for defensive. Offensive as well. You've got ways to scale minions, you've got ways to scale mana, you've got ways to scale corpse abilities. Bunch of different offensive options, and they're all super powerful. Full point for offense. How many archetypes and builds can it sustain? This has sustained a bunch of different kinds of builds over time. You've got all of the separate corpse mechanics, which scale in different ways. You've got a variety of different minion builds that you can scale. You can even used to even scale some like mana type abilities with Essence Glutton before. So I think it can sustain a variety of different kinds of builds. They are more specialized, which I think is fine, but there are very many different ways to scale all those different kinds of builds. So I think it gets a full point there. Is it actually good? Are the numbers good? Is it played? Absolutely. One of the more popular Ascendancies in the game. Historically, the most popular Ascendancy in the game, because people really like minions playing the game for them instead. Numbers are powerful. Everything's good about the Ascendancy. Easily gets a 5 out of 5. I personally think that the only thing that I would really want to change about the Necromancer Ascendancy is make it more specialized in like a legion of minions. Like make it so that having a whole bunch of minions is better than having like a few stronger minions or one specialized kind of minion. I think you could leave that maybe to another Ascendancy. Make it so that like varying types of minions altogether are very powerful for this Ascendancy. I think that's something that that I would change about it. That's more of just like a personal thing. It doesn't actually make the Ascendancy better in my opinion. But yeah, Necromancer gets a 5 out of 5 for me. And that is going to be it for the video. I'm glad to know that now all of you hate me as much as the Occultist players hated me from before, because I've trashed on most of the Ascendancies in the game, besides the few that were pretty good, you know, like the 3 that I said were 5 out of 5s. But I want to remind you, if you disagree with anything I said in the video, or you have other cool ideas on ways that you would change these Ascendancies to give them more interesting and impactful mechanics, let me know down in the comments, because I would like to, you know, have some information about it. I try to respond to a lot of these comments if I disagree with them, or if I think they're good or cool or interesting or stuff like that, so let me know. And remember, boys, if you enjoyed this content, give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest content, and stay safe out there in raid class, and I'll see you guys in the next video.